Hello and welcome back to our study of the Law of Moses. We have been studying sexuality and marriage over the past few weeks, and we are ready to get into divorce and remarriage today. Now, we touched on them briefly last week when we considered Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. Let's go ahead and return to that text, and we will focus today on a couple of points from that text. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies, who took her to be his wife, then her former husband, who sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife, after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. And you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. So what we see in this law is that the law of Moses provides for divorce in cases of infidelity. Although Israel, of course, later interprets this law to mean that they can divorce for any reason so long as they give a certificate of divorce. Or that's what Israel comes to focus on, is the giving of the certificate. They see that is the main thing. But in this encounter that the Pharisees have with Jesus in Matthew 19, we see that Israel has misread the law, that divorce is only to be for infidelity. Right? Whenever they read some indecency, that doesn't just mean literally anything that you can slap the name indecent on, right, which turns into literally anything, but it means infidelity. We also see that the law permits remarriage with some conditions. So we're left with two questions about this law. This will be the focus of our study today. Why does the law require a certificate of divorce instead of just sending her away? And how are we to understand this restriction against remarrying one's divorced spouse? Right? Because the big chunk of the law is essentially, it's all couched in a hypothetical. So say you got a guy who finds some indecency in the woman, and he sends her out with a certificate of divorce. She marries a second man, and then for whatever reason, she is separated from the second man. Either she's divorced from him, or he dies. She may not return to the former husband. Actually, it phrases things in terms of the former husband's perspective. Her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife. Right? The restriction is laid primarily on the husband who sent her away to begin with. So how are we supposed to understand that restriction, particularly as we'll see in light of some other things that we read in the scriptures? So let's start with the certificate and what it means, what it's there for. As we have studied in the law before, marriage in antiquity is a highly public affair, and it always is in antiquity. Now, that's the key difference between antiquity and modernity, is that, in modernity, marriage is usually conspicuously public. Right? There's usually a wedding ceremony with guests, and you have a minister who officiates, and they make public vows. So the marriage is sealed before the public and before God. Again, this is all done in the same context, but that's not always the case in modernity. Right? A couple can go before a justice of the peace and get married with no conspicuously public ceremony at all, right? It can be relatively private whenever you go in to have that kind of ceremony done. The marriage is still public, right, in the legal sense. That it is a legal arrangement in which the people at large hold some interest, right? Again, that's why that's the meaning of it being enshrined in laws, that there is a public interest in the marriage. It's public in that sense, but it's not something that's held, again, conspicuously in public, where you have a whole group of family and friends who have been witness to the vows, and you have a minister who basically acts as God's witness, and in modernity you can get away without having those things, right? And even then, modern law usually allows for some form of common law marriage where there is essentially no public involvement whatsoever, right? The state tries to put the public's foot in, even in these cases where the marriage has, for lack of a better term, no legitimacy at all, right? No public legitimacy, right? But that's never the case in antiquity, right? In modernity, if you want to be really private about your marriage, you can be really private about your marriage. In antiquity, that almost never happens. Marriage is always conspicuously public. And we're not just talking the wedding ceremony. The whole thing is conspicuously public. Divorce, as we've seen in the law, is almost always conspicuously public. Remember the law that we read last week about the husband who hates his wife, and so he drags her out to the city, the city gates, in front of the elders at the gate, and makes this accusation against her that she has been, that he didn't find any proof of virginity in her. And so the woman's family has to come out and appear before the gate with the proof of virginity. Again, the whole thing is very, very public. It is a spectacle. The same thing is true of the sota ordeal, right? If you've got a man who is suspicious of his wife, the spirit of jealousy comes over him, even though she's not been caught in any kind of adulterous act. What he does is he takes her to the priest. And that, again, makes the whole thing a highly public spectacle. There's no question what's going on. And this all means, by the way, because, the marriage is very public, the conduct of the marriage is very public, the divorce is very public, that means that the results of any kind of divorce proceedings have to be highly public as well. And that's where the certificate of divorce comes in. In short, it is a public statement that the woman who holds the certificate is no longer married, right? That's why the certificate goes to the woman. It's something that is designed for the woman. It offers protection to the woman. It offers a few protections from her former husband, right? It keeps a capricious man from trying to lay claims on her and then dumping her just whenever he wants, right? Which is easily something that can happen in the ancient world. All she has to do is produce the certificate of divorce, and the elders of the city or the town can have him punished for what he's doing to her. All right. It also, again, publicly signifies that she is eligible for remarriage. Right? That's built into what we read in Deuteronomy chapter 24, that she has the certificate of divorce in her hand, and she goes off and marries another man. That's part of what the certificate of divorce equips her to do in ancient Israel. Now, again, I feel like we need to step in here and make the same caveat that we've made every week for the last several weeks. What we're doing here is descriptive. This is just what the law says. This is what happened in Israel. This is not prescriptive. In other words, this is not meant to say, here is the standard that we live under or ought to live under in the New Testament era, in the church today. Again, Matthew 19 makes it clear that what's going on under the law is not God's intention for man for all time. So this is just what's happening in Israel. The certificate of divorce equips her to remarry. Now, that said, does it create an ideal situation for the woman? Well, no. Not in antiquity, absolutely not. Her options are still severely limited. Although, again, by most ancient standards, she's still able to enter into contracts on her own. She's not. That's another thing the certificate equips her to do. She's not completely helpless in society anymore, and that makes it better than a lot of the alternatives that you would find in the ancient world. Right? Consider the plight of widows. in the ancient world. The divorced woman is teetering on the edge of that status in antiquity, and part of what the certificate does is gives her a little bit of protection in those instances. All right, so what about the restriction against remarrying? This is where we're going to spend, I think, the bulk of our time today. I want us to consider this in light of of a case, an example. Let's look at the example of King David. Remember, David's first wife, Michal, is the daughter of King Saul. We read about her in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 20 through 27. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Saul thought, "Let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." Therefore Saul said to David a second time, "You shall now be my son-in-law." And Saul commanded his servants, "Speak to David in private, and say, Behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then become the king's son-in-law." And Saul's servants spoke those words in the ears of David, and David said, "Does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation?" And the servants of Saul told him, Thus and so did David speak. Then Saul said, "Thus shall you say to David, The king desires no bride price, except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies." Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. Before the time had expired, David arose and went, along with his men, and killed 200 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him his daughter Michal for a wife. All right, so things obviously are already sour between Saul and David. Saul is trying to trick David into getting himself killed, and lo and behold, David is actually able to go out and collect this bride price that Saul has asked for. And so, the last thing we read is that Saul gives Michal, his daughter, to David for a wife. And this is David's first wife. Now, as things continue to sour between Saul and David, we learn that Saul pulls another dirty trick on David after this episode with Nabal. You remember Nabal and Abigail. We'll kind of catch the tail end of all that. 1 Samuel 25, beginning in verse 42. And Abigail hurried and rose and mounted a donkey, and her 5 young women attended her. She followed the messengers of David and became his wife. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. Saul had given Michal his daughter, David's wife, to Palti the son of Laish, who was of Galim. So, after Nabal dies, his widow Abigail marries David, and then David marries a third woman, Ahinoam. So now he's got 3 wives, but his first wife, Michal, has been taken from him and given to another man, Palti the son of Laish, and so she becomes Palti's wife as well. So things are starting to get complex. Now, ultimately, David gets Michal back. We get another update on David's wives in 2 Samuel chapter 3. And ultimately, the result of this is we learn about how David also gets Michal back. So we'll start in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 2. And sons were born to David at Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon of Ahinoam of Jezreel, and his second, Chileab, of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggit. The fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ithream, of Eglah, David's wife. These were born to David in Hebron. While there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. Now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah. the daughter of Aiah. And Ishbosheth said to Abner, Why have you gone into my father's concubine? Then Abner was very angry over the words of Ishbosheth, and said, Am I a dog's head of Judah? To this day I keep showing steadfast love to the house of Saul your father, to his brothers, and to his friends, and have not given you into the hand of David. And yet you charge me today with a fault concerning a woman? God do so to Abner and more also, if I do not accomplish for David what the Lord has sworn to him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul, and set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah, from Dan to Beersheba. And Ishbosheth could not answer Abner another word, because he feared him. And Abner sent messengers to David on his behalf, saying, To whom does the land belong? Make your covenant with me, and behold, my hand shall be with you to bring over all Israel to you. And he said, Good, I will make a covenant with you. But one thing I require of you, that is, you shall not see my face, unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see my face. Then David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, Give me my wife Michal, for whom I paid the bridal price of 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband Paltiel, the son of Laish. But her husband went with her, weeping after her all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, Go, return. And he returned. All right. There's a lot in that passage. Things are an absolute mess in Israel, which, what's new, right? But we read that David now has no fewer than 6 wives, other than Michal, right? Each of the 6 sons that we read about at the beginning of the passage, they're all born to him by different women, which would make Michal, again, one of 7 wives at this point. And on top of that, we've got this business with Abner making himself strong in Saul's house, which is a euphemism for doing exactly the thing that Ishbosheth accuses him of doing, right? Abner's not mad because, well, Abner's essentially mad because he's being called out on it. He's guilty of sin. And so he changes allegiance. He goes over to David, and David says, sure, I'll take you if, on this condition, you bring me back Michal. And so then Ishbosheth has to send Michal, his sister, back over to David. And that is especially a mess because, again, remember, David is demanding Michal back as a sign of goodwill, that Abner is going to help him take the kingdom from Ishbosheth. And the one who has to make the payment is Ishbosheth himself. The whole thing's just... The more and more you read about poor Ishbosheth, you feel really sorry for him. He is a really pitiful character. But the whole thing is a mess. The whole thing is an absolute mess. But David, here in the end, gets Michal, his first wife, back and adds her to the other 6. So, the question, and this is something that gets raised in Rabbinic Judaism, did David sin by taking Michal back? Now, the question, of course, is muddied by the fact that David is now married 6 other women, and is ultimately going to marry more, as we learn later in David's story. We're not going to go over that today, but we know obviously of Bathsheba. David's quite the man about town, we'll say. And when we're asking, did David sin by taking Michal back, we might be inclined to say, buddy, that's the least of David's problems. But let's focus on this question. Did David sin by taking Michal back? Now, if you were paying close attention to the whole story, you might have noticed, you might object to the whole premise. This isn't even a question of Deuteronomy 24, because whenever Saul takes Michal away from David, David does not formally divorce her. There is no certificate of divorce. All right? And that's thinking like a good Second Temple period Jew, by the way. Right? You focused right in on, it's the certificate of divorce. That's the important part. Legally, that doesn't clear everything up. Right? She has still been given to another man. And that is still one of the concerns of the law in Deuteronomy 24, that the reason why you're not supposed to take her back is because she has been defiled, and it would defile the land to take her back. And this is precisely the same difficulty that we noticed last week with Hosea's wife Gomer, and by extension all Israel. Remember the lesson of Hosea. The Lord has Hosea buy Gomer back, because the Lord himself buys Israel back. And we noticed, again, the same difficulty there. You would naturally expect some kind of permanent divorce, or for Gomer to be put to death. By extension, you would expect Israel to be put out for good, or to be extinguished entirely. And yet, the whole lesson that the Lord teaches through the prophet is that he is merciful. And he expresses that by having Hosea be merciful to Gomer. But again, it is a similar difficulty that we're experiencing here with David and Michal. We should also consider, by the way, that this law, and this I think is maybe one of the chief difficulties, right? You look at David, and you think, well, that doesn't necessarily introduce any kind of difficulty of interpretation with Deuteronomy 24. Because again, you just look at David and you say, look, when it comes to women, David is a sinner through and through, from beginning to end. It doesn't, again, this matter almost seems like the least of David's problems. So there's no kind of interpretive issue with Deuteronomy 24. Where the interpretive issue comes in is whenever we consider this law in light of Paul's instructions in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. Paul says, "To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife." All right, so now we have an example, and we have a commandment from the New Testament. Paul teaches that divorcees must either remain unmarried or reconcile, which seems to be explicitly forbidden in the law, in Deuteronomy 24. Is it another example of something that has changed in some way between the old law and the new? We'll have some more to say about that, but the language used doesn't strike us particularly that way. Paul emphasizes here, by the way, this is not just his personal choice. This is not his personal advice, but the commandment of the Lord himself, that those who divorce are either to remain unmarried or to be reconciled, that is, remarry the divorced spouse. So what is with the law's command not to remarry a divorced spouse? How do we square all of these things? The ancient Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria explains this law in connection to pandering. All right, it's kind of a loose connection. You'll see as we read. This is from his work, Special Laws. "But if any man should choose to form an alliance with such a woman, he must be content to bear the reputation of effeminacy and a complete want of manly courage and vigor, as if he had been castrated and deprived of the most useful portion of the soul, namely that disposition which hates iniquity, by which the affairs both of houses and cities are placed on a good footing, and as having stamped deeply on his character two of the greatest of all iniquities, adultery and the employment of a pander. For the reconciliations which take place subsequently are indications of the death of each. Let him therefore suffer the punishment appointed together with his wife." All right, he's talking about Deuteronomy 24 in this context. So when he talks about a man choosing to form an alliance with such a woman, he's talking about a formerly divorced spouse. He's talking about this circumstance that we read in Deuteronomy 24. And he says that any man that would do that, besides being considered effeminate, he might as well be castrated. He says this is what he's guilty of. He has stamped deeply on his character two of the greatest of all iniquities: adultery and the employment of a pander, right? Because those kinds of reconciliations, he said, are indications of the death of each. Meaning he's bearing the punishment of an adulterer and a panderer in the act of taking this divorced wife back. Now, just so we're clear on what we mean by this, right? Because sometimes we use pander to mean something differently than what's being used here. Pandering is the polite term for pimping. And it is entirely possible that what the law intends in Deuteronomy 24 is to keep men from pandering their wives out. Remember, we said one of the protections that the certificate of divorce offers the divorced wife is that her ex-husband can't yank her around now. He can't, kind of put her out of the house, and then whenever he's in the mood, lay claims on her and say, actually, she's my wife, and she needs to come back in the house and perform the duty of a wife for me. The certificate of divorce, again, protects her from that kind of capriciousness. It is entirely possible that the law is intending to keep men from pandering their wives out. So in other words, kind of taking it a step further, and not just sending the woman out of the house, but selling her off for those kinds of services. We know that that practice is not uncommon in antiquity. For example, several weeks ago, we read from the Middle Assyrian laws a pretty lengthy law about women who procure other married women for their husbands to sleep with. That's pandering. Right? And the Middle Assyrian laws explicitly forbid that kind of pandering. It happened. So if it's forbidden in law, that means it happened in antiquity and was common enough that it was prohibited and punished severely. Right? That law carried the potential for the death penalty, potentially for all three involved. Right? If the woman being pandered was willing, right? If she was unwilling, she would be allowed to live. But the other two, the husband and the wife who had procured the third woman, they would be put to death. Now, we know that it's not just a problem in other parts of the ancient Near East. We know that it's a problem for Israel because we know that it was a problem for the patriarchs. It was a big problem for the patriarchs. Go to Genesis chapter 12. I'm going to start reading in verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they'll say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but let you live. Say that you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake he dealt well with Abram. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, What is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Now remember, if you're reading the King James or the New King James, Pharaoh says, I might have taken her for my wife. And normally the King James and the New King James are good about putting things in italics that aren't there in the original. For some reason, our translators have chosen not to insert any kind of italics, even though they have very clearly inserted something into the English translation that is just not there. The might have part is completely made up. It has absolutely no basis in the Hebrew. None at all. And when you understand that Pharaoh says, I took her for my wife, like we're not talking about, ooh, we had a really close call there. No, they crossed that line. No, she was part of Pharaoh's harem, and he defiled her. And that's why he's being plagued. And when you look at the rest of the circumstances in the passage, there's no buts about it. Abram panders Sarai to Pharaoh. Abram got paid for it. The text tells us explicitly, Pharaoh gives him all of this stuff in exchange for Sarai. It doesn't come out explicitly, right, and say in so many words, Abram pandered Sarah. Abram pimped her out. And if you really want to, if you want to wink and nod hard enough, sure, it wasn't pandering. Abram's a complete moron. He is a moral imbecile. He is not able to add two and two together. Wait a minute. This woman is my wife. I have sent her into another man's harem. I don't know what's going to happen when I do that. Probably nothing, said no husband ever. And wow, this guy that just took my wife into his harem, he's paying me all of this stuff, all of these animals and slaves, and man, I'm rich now. It's just all a great coincidence, isn't it? I mean, look, if we're that naive, sure, fine, whatever. Let's not pretend, though, that Abram was that naive, because this is not the last time he does it. He turns around and he does exactly the same thing again to Abimelech in Genesis chapter 20. And we're not going to read through the whole story there. We're going to read the tail end of it, because Abram tells Abimelech that he's been doing this literally everywhere that he travels with Sarah, his wife. All right, let's pick up in Genesis chapter 20, verse 10. And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see that you did this thing?" Abraham said, "I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This is the kindness you must do to me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother.'" And so what we're left with is wondering, who knows how many times Abraham has sent Sarah out to some other man and gotten paid for it. It's an uncomfortable question, but it's the one the text forces us into. And then we see that their son Isaac is willing to do exactly the same thing to Rebekah in Genesis 26 with another Abimelech. Right, remember, Abimelech is likely just a royal nickname or a title. It means my dad is king. Who knows? Could be exactly the same king. I kind of doubt it, though. The point is that Isaac is willing to engage in exactly the same practice. He is willing to send his wife out to another man in exchange for some benefit. So it's not inconceivable, not at all. If the patriarchs were doing it, if people in other parts of the ancient Near East were doing it, so much so that it had to be forbidden by law, it is not inconceivable that men in ancient Israel would basically try to launder their pandering activities by repeatedly divorcing and then remarrying the same woman. Right? You could see how that would work. Right? If there's some expectation that, no, you're not supposed to pimp your wife out to somebody else, you could try to legitimize it by formalizing the whole thing. See, I gave her a certificate of divorce. She wasn't my wife whenever she went off to that other man. And this other guy chooses to give me gifts. So what? So what? Has nothing to do with anything. And he decided after a while that he didn't like her either, and he divorced her, and she decided to come back. You know, just, it all kind of works out. Sure. Sure. I was born yesterday. All right, everybody who believes that, stand on your head. Again, when you realize just how corrupt people are, and how corrupt they were even in the ancient world, this kind of thing, it's a possibility, right? The other possibility is that, again, it is just blanketly meant for any kind of remarriage and reconciliation, and that's something that basically changes, that God undermines through the prophets and then just explicitly changes in the New Testament. And that's a possibility as well. That still wouldn't rule out the pandering, by the way. But that's my best guess at why the law seemingly prohibits this practice that Paul later explicitly encourages, that is, reconciliation. Now, that's not to say that Paul is by any means encouraging pandering here, right? Let's not get that idea. We are expected to live better than that. We're expected to treat people better than that. So that's where we're going to wrap up our whole study of sex, marriage, divorce, and remarriage and the law. One thing, like the takeaway from all of this is, as we said just a minute ago, man is rotten and corrupt. And they are so rotten and corrupt that you have to put protections in place that, from any kind of reasonable moral standard, you wouldn't think you would have to put in place. This is just true of adultery and divorce in general, right? Anybody with any kind of moral decency understands you don't treat people that way. You don't go running around on your spouse. And you don't just kick your spouse out of the house for no reason at all, right? You don't pander your spouse out to somebody else. All of these things, if it weren't for the sin in the garden, if it weren't for the fall, all of these things would be literally unthinkable, right? We would not be able to conceive of these things in our minds. But we are sinful. And so all kinds of people conceive of all of these things in their minds all the time and try to justify them, try to legitimize them. And the law stands in to hedge against our worst inclinations, at least the worst inclinations of the nation of Israel in antiquity. And then God, from there, uses those laws to teach us lessons about holiness, and specifically about his mercy, the grace that he extends to us, how we are to treat other people. All right, so we'll finish up just by saying again what we've said. This material is descriptive rather than prescriptive. It's clear from the Gospels that a whole lot of what happens under the law is not God's full intention for man for all time. And that shouldn't make us uncomfortable, because we've read exactly the same thing about the dietary laws. They are not God's intention for man for all time. Again, the dietary laws are loosened, whereas the marriage, divorce, and remarriage laws are tightened whenever you make that transition from Old Testament to New Testament, from the law of Moses to the law of Christ, as it were. But in both cases, the law of Moses acts as spiritual training wheels for Israel to understand the nature of God and his holiness, the nature of mercy, how they are to be holy, how they are to treat other people, the whole thing that we find ultimately fulfilled and consummated in the New Testament. All right, so now that we're finished with marriage law, we're going to move into property law. And it's a natural segue from marriage to property, because remember, that's what marriage is mostly about in antiquity. Not about romance, mostly about passing down in property to legitimate heirs. So we'll start next week by talking about inheritance, and then we'll move into other topics concerning property in the ancient world. So until next time, take care. Bye-bye.